January 20th, 1942, 15 men sat around an elegant table in a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin. The meeting lasted a mere 90 minutes. There were no shouts, no gunshots, no blood on the floor, only coffee, cognac, and a meticulously drafted protocol. And yet, in those 90 minutes, the fate of millions of human beings was sealed. It was there, in that mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and century-old trees, that the systematic murder of 11 million European Jews was planned with bureaucratic coldness. The man who presided over that meeting was not Adolf Hitler. It was Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most sinister and ruthless figures in modern history. And behind him, pulling the strings from the shadows, was Heinrich Himmler, the supreme architect of the Nazi terror apparatus. Together, these two men designed the machinery of the Holocaust, with a precision that remains chilling to this day. But how did these two individuals come to be Europe's executioners? What drove them? Pure hatred, unbridled ambition for power, or a cold and calculated strategy? Was it a combination of the three, or is there something deeper, more disturbing that conventional history does not always tell us? Before we begin, our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers. It seems like a lot, but with your help, we can achieve it. Subscribe now. Click, like, and be a part of this story. What you are about to hear is not just an account of dates and battles. It is the story of how two men, with apparently common biographies, transformed into the most efficient engineers of death of the 20th century. It is the story of how bureaucracy became a lethal weapon, of how documents signed in centrally heated offices translated into gas chambers and mass graves. It is the story of Nazi Germany seen from within, from the very bowels of power, where the decisions that destroyed millions of lives were made between reports, memorandums, and handshakes. And there is something you may not know, something that makes this story even more unsettling. Reinhard Heydrich, the man whom the Nazi machinery itself nicknamed the Blonde Beast, the man whom even Hitler described as the man with the iron heart, lived for years under the shadow of a rumour that could have destroyed him, the suspicion that he himself had Jewish ancestry. How is it possible that one of the main perpetrators of the Holocaust carried such a ghost? And to what extent did that rumour shape his cruelty? Let's find out. To understand the dark plan of Himmler and Heydrich, we must first understand where they came from. They were not born monsters. They were born as ordinary men, in ordinary families, in a Germany that was about to cease being ordinary. Heinrich Himmler was born on October 7th, 1900, in Munich, Bavaria, into a respectable middle-class Catholic family. His father, Gebhard Friedrich Himmler, was a high school teacher and tutor to Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, from whom young Heinrich received his name. The Himmler family was conservative, disciplined, deeply religious, and obsessed with order. The father imposed a strict routine at home, fixed times for eating, studying, praying, and sleeping. Every aspect of young Heinrich's life was regulated, and that obsession with control, with structure, with the system, would accompany him for the rest of his life, albeit with consequences his father could never have imagined. As a child, Heinrich was sickly, thin, with round glasses, and a physical constitution that was far from the Germanic ideal he would later promote with fanatical fervour. He was not athletic. He was not charismatic. He did not have the imposing presence of other Nazi leaders. He was, in many ways, a grey man, a born bureaucrat, someone who found his power not in speeches to the masses, but in archives, in lists, in the meticulous organisation of data and people. And it was precisely that organisational capacity that made him one of the most dangerous figures of the Third Reich. As a young man, Himmler dreamed of being a soldier. The First World War broke out when he was just 14, and throughout his adolescence, he longed to participate in the conflict. He enlisted as a cadet in 1917, at 17, but the war ended before he could see combat. That frustration marked him profoundly. While other veterans returned from the front with wounds and medals, Himmler carried the shame of not having fired a single shot. That feeling of having arrived too late for glory, of not having proven his worth on the battlefield, fueled in him a desperate need to prove himself. And that need would find its channel in politics. After the war, Himmler studied agronomy at the Technical University of Munich. He was a mediocre student, without particular brilliance, but during those years he began to move in nationalist and anti-Semitic circles. Post-war Germany was a perfect breeding ground for resentment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had imposed humiliating conditions on the country: territorial losses, disarmament, astronomical economic reparations. Millions of Germans felt their nation had been betrayed, stabbed in the back, the infamous Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, and were looking for culprits. The Jews, the communists, the politicians of the Weimar Republic, all became scapegoats for a national humiliation that burned like an open wound. In this context, Himmler discovered Nazism. In August 1923, he joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. He participated in the failed beer hall putsch in November of that year, where Hitler tried to seize power by force in Munich. The coup failed spectacularly. Hitler was arrested and imprisoned in Landsberg prison, where he would write his infamous Mein Kampf. Himmler, for his part, escaped without significant legal consequences, but the event radicalized him further. He had seen the power of the movement up close, the energy of the masses, violence as a political tool, and he wanted more. During the following years, Himmler slowly rose through the party ranks. He was not a brilliant orator like Goebbels, nor a military strategist like Göring, nor a charismatic ideologue like Hitler himself. But he had something the others did not: an almost superhuman capacity for organization and absolute loyalty to the Führer. In 1929, Hitler named him Reichsführer SS, leader of the Schutzstaffel, the SS, which at that time was little more than a small group of Hitler's personal bodyguards, with just 280 members. What Himmler did with that organization in the following years is one of the most terrifying chapters in the history of the 20th century. But before we get there, we need to meet the other protagonist of this story, because if Himmler was the architect, Heydrich was the engineer. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich was born on March 7, 1904, in Halle, Saxony, into a family of musicians. His father, Bruno Heydrich, was a respected opera tenor and founder of the Halle Conservatory of Music. His mother, Elisabeth Anna Maria Amalia Kranz, was a pianist and actress. The Heydrich home was filled with music, art, culture. The young Reinhard grew up playing the violin with a skill many described as extraordinary. Years later, on Berlin nights, the man who ran Europe's most feared espionage apparatus would play chamber pieces with a sensitivity that moved listeners to tears. That duality, the beauty of art and the brutality of power, would define his entire existence. But Heydrich's childhood was not idyllic. At school, his classmates bullied him. They called him Moses and the White Goat, mocking a persistent rumour that his father had Jewish blood. The origin of this rumour was a detail in Hugo Riemann's Music Encyclopedia, where next to Bruno Heydrich's name was a note identifying him as Suss, a surname associated with Jewish families. Although the family vehemently denied any connection, the rumour haunted Reinhard throughout his life, and that bullying, that constant humiliation, that shadow of a doubt about his own identity left an indelible mark on his personality. To what extent was Heydrich's fierce anti-Semitism a compensation for that suspicion? Did he kill Jews to prove he was not one of them? It is a question that historians have debated for decades, and the answer is not simple. But what is clear is that Heydrich developed a cold, ambitious, and ruthless personality from a young age. He learned to use intimidation as a shield and cruelty as a weapon. If someone made fun of him, he remembered. And when he had power, he made sure no one would ever make fun of him again. After finishing his studies, Heydrich joined the German Navy in 1922 at 18. He was tall, over 6 feet, blonde, athletic, with blue eyes and sharp features. In many ways, he physically embodied the Aryan ideal that Nazi propaganda would glorify years later. In the Navy, he excelled as an intelligence officer and fencer. He was the Navy's fencing champion. But his military career ended abruptly in April 1931, when he was expelled for a sex scandal. Heydrich had maintained a relationship with a young woman while engaged to another, Lena von Osten, and when the former's father demanded reparations, a naval court of honor found him guilty of improper conduct and dismissed him. It was a devastating blow. Heydrich, at 27, found himself without a career, without income, without a future. And it was precisely at this moment of crisis that Lena von Osten, his fiancée, suggested he contact Heinrich Himmler's SS. Lena was a fervent Nazi sympathizer, and she knew Himmler was looking for someone to create an intelligence service within the SS. The meeting between Himmler and Heydrich took place on June 14, 1931, at the chicken farm Himmler owned in Waldschudern, near Munich. Himmler, who by then was already leading the SS with several thousand members, needed an internal espionage service to monitor both the party's enemies and members of the Nazi movement itself. He gave Heydrich 20 minutes to sketch out on paper how he would organize such an intelligence service. Heydrich, with his naval intelligence background and analytical mind, drew a diagram that deeply impressed Himmler. In those 20 minutes, sitting on that farm surrounded by chickens, one of history's most lethal alliances was sealed. Himmler hired Heydrich on the spot. He assigned him a desk, a typewriter, and a modest salary. And from that moment on, the two men began to build, brick by brick, document by document, the edifice of terror that would consume Europe. The intelligence service Heydrich created was initially called the IC-Dienst and was later renamed Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the security service of the SS. From the beginning, Heydrich designed it as a total espionage network. It not only monitored the enemies of Nazism, but also the Nazis themselves. No one was safe from his eyes. Heydrich created files on every relevant person in the Reich: politicians, military officers, industrialists, artists, religious figures, collecting secrets, weaknesses, vices, betrayals. Those files were his true power, because in a regime where paranoia was the norm, whoever controlled the information controlled everything, and Heydrich controlled the information. But what kind of man was Reinhard Heydrich in private? Was he the same cold monster who signed extermination orders? The descriptions from those who knew him paint a disturbing portrait. Walter Schellenberg, his subordinate in the SD, described him as the hidden brain of the Nazi system, and as a man of diabolical cruelty, who could nonetheless be charming, witty, and socially adept when it suited him. At dinners with foreign diplomats, Heydrich was the perfect host, educated, cultured, capable of talking about music, art, philosophy. But behind that facade hid a mind that calculated every word, every gesture, every smile, seeking advantages, information, power. His wife Lena described him years later as a tormented man. In her memoirs, published decades after the war, Lena claimed that Reinhard suffered from recurring nightmares, and that on more than one occasion, she found him in front of the bathroom mirror in the middle of the night, staring intently, as if searching for something in his own reflection. What did he see? The man he wanted to be, or the man he feared being? That duality is key to understanding Heydrich, and also to understanding why his alliance with Himmler was so effective. Because if Heydrich was the sword, Himmler was the shield. If Heydrich acted, Himmler planned. If Heydrich inspired terror in person, Himmler inspired terror through the system. And together, they turned the SS into something the world had never seen. A state within a state, an empire of death with its own police. its own army, its own businesses, its own concentration camps, and finally, its own extermination factories. How did they do it? How did they transform a personal guard of 280 men into an organization of over 1 million members that controlled virtually every aspect of life and death in occupied Europe? Let's go step by step. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, Himmler's SS already had more than 50,000 members, but they were still subordinate to the SA, the Sturmabteilung. The brown shirts led by Ernst Röhm, Hitler's old comrade, who had been fundamental in the early years of the Nazi movement. The SA were an enormous paramilitary force, more than 3 million men, and Röhm saw them as the future army of the Reich, a revolutionary army that would replace the old Reichswehr, the regular German army. Röhm's ambition deeply worried Hitler. The generals of the regular army, whose support Hitler needed to consolidate his power, saw the SA as a direct threat, and Himmler and Heydrich, with their espionage networks, fed that concern. The SD's reports detailed supposed conspiracies by Röhm against Hitler, plans for a coup, contacts with enemies of the regime. How much of that was true? Probably very little. But Himmler and Heydrich did not need the truth. They needed suspicion. And suspicion was enough. The night of June 30th, 1934, known as the Night of the Long Knives, or, in German, Unternehmen Kolibri, Operation Hummingbird, squads of the SS executed dozens of SA leaders, including Ernst Röhm, who was arrested at his hotel in Bad Wiessee and shot 2 days later in his cell at Stadelheim prison. The official death toll was just over 80, but historians estimate that the victims may have exceeded 200. Among the murdered were not only members of the SA, conservative politicians, former rivals of Hitler, even people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time also fell. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was murdered with his wife in their own home. Gregor Strasser, a former leader of the NSDAP's left wing, was executed in the cellars of the Gestapo. The Night of the Long Knives was a turning point. It not only eliminated the SA as a rival to the SS, but it also set a terrifying precedent. The Nazi regime was willing to murder its own. No one was safe. And the men who had organized and executed this purge with surgical efficiency were Himmler and Heydrich. From that moment on, the SS became the most powerful organization in Germany after Hitler himself. And Himmler, with Heydrich as his executive arm, began to build an empire that encompassed everything from the secret police to the concentration camps, from elite military units to racial engineering programs. Let's pause here for a moment, because it is important to understand the structure of what Himmler and Heydrich created. It was not chaotic, it was not improvised. It was a system, a monstrous machine with parts that fit together with industrial precision. The SS was divided into several main branches. The Allgemeine SS, the General SS, was the political and administrative branch, composed of part-time members who kept their civilian jobs but participated in party activities and exercised social control in their communities. They were the eyes and ears of the regime on every corner of Germany. The Waffen-SS was the military branch, the combat units that fought on the fronts of the Second World War. They began as a small elite corps, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's personal armed guard, and grew to become a true parallel army, with more than 900,000 soldiers by the end of the war, organized into almost 40 divisions. The Waffen-SS fought with a ferocity that was legendary, and they also committed some of the worst atrocities of the war, such as the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre in France, where on June 10, 1944, the Das Reich Division murdered 642 men, women, and children, or the Malmedy massacre in Belgium, where 84 American prisoners of war were executed in December 1944. The SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, were responsible for administering the concentration camps, and later the extermination camps. The skull symbol on their caps was not merely decorative, it was a statement of intent. These units, under the initial command of Theodor Eicke, established the model of systematic brutality that would be applied in Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, and finally in Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. And then there was the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the RSHA, the Reich Central Security Office, created on September 27, 1939, just weeks after the start of the Second World War. The RSHA was Heydrich's most sophisticated creation, a super agency that merged the SD, the Gestapo, the State Secret Police, the Kripo, the Criminal Police, and other security services into a single centralized structure under his direct command. It was, in essence, the brain of the Nazi repressive apparatus, from the RSHA, deportations, mass executions, espionage, counterinsurgency, the persecution of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political dissidents, and anyone the regime considered undesirable were coordinated. Heydrich ran the RSHA with an efficiency that his own subordinates described as terrifying. He worked from the early hours of the morning until late at night. He read every report, reviewed every file, approved every operation. He was an obsessive perfectionist who did not tolerate error and who punished incompetence with a severity that bordered on sadism. Under his command, the RSHA became a well-oiled machine of repression, surveillance, and death. But Himmler and Heydrich did not limit themselves to repression. They also dreamed, and their dreams were as grandiose as they were terrifying. Himmler and Heydrich not only built a system, they designed a plan for extermination without precedent. But what do you think truly motivated them? Ideological hatred, ambition for power, or a cold strategy? Leave your opinion in the comments. Himmler, in particular, had a vision that went far beyond politics and war. He saw the SS not just as a military or police organization, but as a chivalric order, a new racial elite that would refound European civilization on pure biological bases. He was obsessed with Germanic mythology, with Arthurian legends, with runes, with occultism. He converted Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia into a kind of Nazi Camelot, a ceremonial centre where the high commanders of the SS met like the Knights of the Round Table. In the castle's north tower, Himmler had a circular room built with a black sun mosaic on the floor, the Schwarze Sonne, which became one of the most recognizable symbols of Nazi mysticism. Beneath, that room was a crypt designed to house the coats of arms of the 12 most important SS generals, a direct imitation of medieval legends. Was Himmler mad? It's a legitimate question, and the answer depends on how we define madness. Himmler was not a lunatic disconnected from reality. He was an extremely competent administrator, capable of managing a bureaucratic empire of colossal dimensions. But at the same time, he sincerely believed in racial pseudosciences, in the biological superiority of the Aryan race, in the existence of a lost civilization of Nordic supermen that had to be recovered. He financed expeditions to the Himalayas to search for vestiges of this supposed original race. He sponsored research in the Ahnenerbe, the Society for Ancestral Heritage, an institution that mixed legitimate archaeology with delirious occultism, and ended up performing atrocious medical experiments on prisoners in concentration camps. The Ahnenerbe, founded in 1935 by Himmler, along with the Dutch professor Herman Veerf and the social Darwinist Richard Walter Dara, began as an academic project to study the roots of the Aryan race. But under the direction of SS Colonel Wolfram Sievers, it transformed into something much more sinister. The institution sent expeditions to Tibet in 1938 to 1939, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer, to measure Tibetan skulls and search for evidence of racial connections between the Nordic and Central Asian peoples. It also financed archaeological excavations in Greece, Scandinavia, and the Middle East, seeking proof of a supposed original Aryan civilization. But the worst was yet to come. During the war, the Ahnenerbe became the institutional cover for some of the most horrendous medical experiments in history. In the Dachau concentration camp, Dr. Sigmund Rascher, under the supervision of the Ahnenerbe, subjected prisoners to extreme altitude experiments, locking them in low-pressure chambers to simulate conditions at high altitude. The subjects died amid convulsions while the researchers took notes. In other experiments, prisoners were submerged in icy water for hours to study the effects of hypothermia. Many died. Those who survived suffered permanent damage. In the Ravensbrück camp, Dr. Karl Gebhardt performed experiments on bone transplantation and deliberate infection with bacteria on female prisoners, many of them young Polish women who were left maimed for life and whom the other prisoners called the rabbits for being used as laboratory animals. All this was done in the name of science. All this was meticulously documented. All this was approved by Himmler. And while Himmler built his mystical bureaucratic empire, Heydrich sharpened his sword. What drove Heydrich? Historians have debated this question for decades. Some, like biographer Robert Gerwerf, argue that Heydrich was fundamentally an opportunist, a man without deep ideological convictions, who simply used the Nazi system to satisfy his personal ambition. Others, like Eduard Husum, argue that Heydrich developed a genuine anti-Semitism, fueled by the trauma of his childhood and the culture of hate in which he was immersed. And still others suggest that Heydrich was a classic sociopath, a man incapable of empathy, who found in Nazism the perfect stage to exercise his cruelty without consequences. What is not disputed is his effectiveness. From his position as head of the SD and later the RSHA, Heydrich was the main organizer of the regime's anti-Semitic persecution, step by step, rung by rung, from legal discrimination to industrial genocide. But how did it get from verbal anti-Semitism to mass murder? How does one go from insults in newspapers to gas chambers? That is perhaps the most important question in all this history, because the Holocaust did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a descending staircase into hell, and on every step of that staircase, Himmler and Heydrich were present. The first step was legal exclusion. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, anti-Semitism went from being a social sentiment to state policy. On April 1st, 1933, just 2 months after the seizure of power, the regime organized a national boycott of Jewish businesses. Members of the SA stood in front of shops, doctors' offices, and law firms of Jewish lawyers, intimidating customers and painting stars of David and anti-Semitic slogans on the windows. Deutsche, wehrt euch, kauf nicht bei Juden. Germans, defend yourselves, do not buy from Jews, the posters read. The boycott was a partial failure. Many Germans ignored it, but it sent a clear message. Jews were no longer welcome in the economic life of Germany. Days later, on April 7th, 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was enacted, which prohibited non-Aryans from holding public office. It was the first in a series of laws that would progressively tighten the noose on the Jewish population of Germany, which at that time numbered approximately 525,000 people, less than 1% of the country's total population. The Nuremberg Laws, promulgated on September 15th, 1935, represented a qualitative leap. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of their German citizenship, turning them into subjects without political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood under penalty of imprisonment. These laws transformed anti-Semitism into a codified legal system, a legal architecture of hatred that defined who was Jewish according to genealogical criteria. Having 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was enough to be so classified, and that created intermediate categories, such as the Mischlinge, the half-breeds, whose very existence was treated as a problem to be solved. And who was in charge of implementing these laws with implacable zeal? Himmler's SS, Heydrich's SD, the Gestapo, which since April 1934 had come under Himmler's control, and whose operational direction fell to Heydrich, with his subordinate Heinrich Müller, known as Gestapo Müller, as head of daily operations. The Gestapo. The full name was Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, and it was exactly what its name indicated, secret and state. It operated outside the ordinary legal framework, with authority to arrest, interrogate, torture, and send anyone to concentration camps without a court order or any legal process. The word Gestapo became synonymous with terror throughout Germany and later throughout occupied Europe. But what few know is that the Gestapo was much smaller than the legend suggests. At its peak, the Gestapo had approximately 32,000 officials to monitor a population of more than 80 million people in the Greater Reich. How was this possible? What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment with the phrase, "I want more stories." This will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help with the video's engagement. Okay. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and leave your like so that YouTube continues to recommend our videos to you. The answer is disturbing. The Gestapo operated largely thanks to denunciations from ordinary citizens, neighbors who denounced neighbors, employees who denounced bosses, wives who denounced husbands. Historian Vandana Joshi has documented that in some cities, up to 40% of Gestapo cases originated from voluntary denunciations by ordinary citizens. It was not just the state that was watching, it was the entire society that had become an accomplice of the repressive apparatus. That is what makes this story so disturbing. It was not just Himmler and Heydrich. It was not just the SS and the Gestapo. It was an entire nation that, to a greater or lesser extent, participated, tolerated, or looked the other way while their neighbors were persecuted, dispossessed, deported, and finally murdered. But let's return to the descending staircase, because there were still many steps to go. The second step was organized violence. The night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, marked the transition from legal discrimination to massive physical violence. In a single night, mobs organized by the SA and the SS destroyed more than 7,500 Jewish businesses, burned or damaged more than 1,400 synagogues in Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, murdered at least 91 Jews, though the real figures were probably much higher, and arrested approximately 30,000 Jewish men who were sent to the concentration camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. The pretext was the assassination of Ernst vom Rath, a German diplomat in Paris, at the hands of Herschel Grinspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jewish youth whose parents had been deported from Germany to Poland in inhumane conditions. But the real driver of the pogrom was the regime's deliberate decision to escalate the violence. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, lit the fuse with an incendiary speech on the night of November 9th. Himmler and Heydrich, for their part, ensured that the SS and the police channeled the violence in an orderly manner, and that the mass arrests were carried out according to previously prepared lists. Kristallnacht was a point of no return. After that night, the persecution of the Jews ceased to be a matter of laws and decrees, to become something physical, tangible, bloody. And what is worse, not only was the regime not punished for it, but it imposed a collective fine of 1 billion marks on the Jewish community itself for the damages caused. The victims had to pay for their own destruction. Can one ask for more proof of a regime's perversion? Unfortunately, yes, because what came next was infinitely worse. The third step was ghettoization and mass deportations. When the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, the number of Jews under Nazi control multiplied exponentially. Poland had the largest Jewish community in Europe, more than 3 million people. Suddenly, the Jewish problem, as the Nazis called it with their dehumanizing bureaucratic jargon, took on completely new dimensions. It was no longer about 500,000 German Jews, it was about millions. Heydrich, as head of the RSHA, issued a directive on September 21st, 1939, just 3 weeks after the invasion of Poland, ordering the concentration of Polish Jews in large cities near railway lines. It was the first step toward the creation of the ghettos. In the following months, ghettos were established throughout occupied Poland, in Lodz, in Warsaw, in Krakow, in Lublin, in Radom, in dozens of cities. Jews were forced to leave their homes, their businesses, their possessions, and to cram into walled and guarded neighborhoods, where conditions were deliberately designed to cause suffering. The Warsaw Ghetto, established in November 1940, was the largest. In an area of just 3.4 square kilometers, less than 3% of the city's surface area, more than 400,000 people were confined. The population density was approximately 120,000 people per square kilometer, a figure that defies imagination. The food rations assigned by the German authorities were a mere 184 calories per day per person, a fraction of what is needed to survive. Hunger was omnipresent. Diseases, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, spread with devastating speed. Between November 1940 and July 1942, before the deportations to Treblinka began, more than 83,000 people died of hunger and disease in the Warsaw Ghetto. 83,000. It is a figure that must be repeated to try to comprehend it. And while those people starved to death behind the ghetto walls, just a few streets away, life went on as normal for non-Jewish Poles and for the Germans in the area. Trams passed through the ghetto without stopping, and passengers could see through the windows the skeletal children begging for bread on the sidewalks. Some looked, others looked away. How is it possible for a society to reach that point? How does such horror become normalized? In the Lodz Ghetto, established in February 1940, the situation was not very different. More than 160,000 Jews were confined in a run-down area of the city. The leader of the Judenrat, the Jewish council imposed by the Nazis to administer the ghetto, was Chaim Romkowski, a controversial figure who ruled with an iron fist, minted his own currency, and went so far as to hand over children and the elderly to the Nazis for deportations, arguing that sacrificing a few would save the others. It did not save them. In August 1944, Romkowski was deported to Auschwitz, where he was murdered. According to some testimonies, it was the camp prisoners themselves who killed him upon recognizing him. But the ghettos, with all their misery, were not the final destination. They were only transit stations. The Nazis were already thinking of something much more radical, and the men who were thinking about it were, once again, Himmler and Heydrich. Because here we arrive at the darkest heart of this story, at the moment when persecution turned into extermination, at the moment when a line was crossed, from which there was no return. When exactly did the Nazis decide to murder all the Jews of Europe? This is one of the most debated questions in the historiography of the Holocaust, and the answer is not as clear as one might think. There was not a single moment, a written decree with Hitler's signature that said, "Kill all the Jews." What there was a process of progressive radicalization, an escalation in which each step made the next one easier. Before the final solution, before the gas chambers and crematoria, there were other plans. Plans that today sound almost absurd, but which at the time were seriously considered by the Nazi leaders. One of them was the Madagascar Plan. In the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, the German Foreign Ministry and Heydrich's RSHA drafted a project to deport all European Jews to the island of Madagascar, which was then a French colony. The idea was to turn the entire island into a kind of Jewish reservation, a gigantic ghetto in the middle of the Indian Ocean, administered by the SS. It was estimated that 4 million Jews would be deported over a period of 4 years. The plan obviously was a disguised death sentence. The conditions in Madagascar would have been lethal for millions of people, without infrastructure, without resources, without medical care. But the plan was never implemented, because the Battle of Britain prevented Germany from obtaining the naval control necessary to carry out the transports. Another project was the mass deportation to the Eastern Territories. After the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, some Nazi planners proposed sending European Jews to the vast expanses of Siberia, where they would die of cold, hunger, and forced labour. This was what was known as extermination through labour, Vernichtung durch Arbeit, a bureaucratic euphemism for slow murder. But the reality of the war in the East dramatically accelerated the radicalisation. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched on June 22, 1941, was much more than a military campaign. It was conceived as a war of ideological annihilation, a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism that did not recognise the rules of conventional warfare. Hitler had made it clear to his generals that this would not be a war like the others. The Commissar Decree, issued in June 1941, ordered the summary execution of all captured Soviet political commissars, and behind the advancing armies came the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen, operational groups, 4 mobile killing units, Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D, with a total of approximately 3,000 men, composed of members of the SS, the Gestapo, the criminal police, the order police, and local volunteers. Their mission was simple and monstrous: to follow the German army as it advanced through Soviet territories and systematically murder Jews, communists, partisans, Roma, and anyone considered an enemy of the Reich. Heydrich was the one who drafted the operational guidelines for the Einsatzgruppen. In meetings held in June 1941, before the start of the invasion, he instructed the commanders of the 4 units on their objectives. The instructions were deliberately ambiguous in some aspects, to allow each commander to decide the scope of the killings, but unequivocal in the essential: the Soviet Jews were to be eliminated. What followed was an unprecedented orgy of violence. In a matter of weeks, the Einsatzgruppen began to shoot entire Jewish communities in the occupied territories. The victims, men, women, children, the elderly, were taken to the outskirts of towns and villages, forced to dig pits or led to the edge of natural ravines, stripped of their clothes and belongings, and shot in cold blood. The bodies fell into the pits, which were then covered with earth. Sometimes those still alive were buried with the dead. The most emblematic and one of the most documented case is the massacre of Babi Yar. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, in a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, Einsatzgruppe C, along with units of German police and Ukrainian collaborators, murdered 33,771 Jews in just 36 hours. The victims were forced to walk to the edge of the ravine, where they were shot by rows of executioners. The bodies piled up layer upon layer. The sound of the gunshots did not cease for 2 days. 33,771 people in 36 hours. And Babi Yar was not an isolated case. It was one among hundreds. In Rumbula, near Riga, Latvia, more than 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto were murdered in 2 days. On November 30th and December 8th, 1941, in Ponary, near Vilnius, Lithuania, approximately 70,000 Jews were shot between July 1941 and July 1944. In Kamianets-Podilsky, Ukraine, 23,600 Jews were murdered between August 27th and 28th, 1941, by Hungarian and German troops. In Odessa, more than 25,000 Jews were murdered in October 1941 by Romanian forces with German support. The Einsatzgruppen reports, the Ereignismeldungen, situation reports, and the Tätigkeitslagerberichte, activity reports, documented these massacres with an administrative coldness that is difficult to process. Each report detailed the number of people murdered, broken down by categories: Jews, Jewesses, Jewish children, communists, partisans, mentally ill. The numbers were added up at the end, as if they were industrial production figures. These reports were compiled, classified, and sent to Berlin, where Heydrich and his team read them, archived them, and used them to plan future operations. It is estimated that the Einsatzgruppen, along with auxiliary police units and local collaborators, murdered between 1.5 and 2 million people between June 1941 and the spring of 1943. The vast majority were Jews. But even this industrial-scale slaughter presented a problem for the Nazis. Not a moral problem, morality had been abandoned long ago, but a logistical and psychological problem. Mass shootings were inefficient in the perverse logic of the perpetrators. They required a lot of ammunition, a lot of time, and left evidence that was difficult to conceal. Moreover, the killers themselves suffered psychological consequences. Himmler personally witnessed a mass shooting in Minsk in August 1941, and according to several testimonies, almost fainted when fragments of brain and blood spattered his uniform. Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, head of the SS in Central Russia, told Himmler that the men carrying out the shootings were becoming psychologically destroyed and that a more humane method was needed. More humane. For the killers, of course, not for the victims. It was in this context that the search for more efficient killing methods was accelerated, and it was in this context that Himmler and Heydrich took the final steps toward the final solution of the Jewish question, Endlösung der Judenfrage, the plan to exterminate all the Jews of Europe using industrial methods. The bridge between mass shootings and gas chambers was the gas vans, the Gaswagen. These vehicles, which externally looked like ordinary transport trucks, had their exhaust pipe redirected to the sealed compartment where the victims were crowded. As the truck drove, carbon monoxide filled the interior, asphyxiating the people locked inside. The bodies were then unloaded into pits. The first gas vans were used in December 1941 in Chelmno, in occupied Poland, and later in the Eastern Territories. They were terribly inefficient. Each truck could only kill a few dozen people per trip, and the drivers and unloading personnel were often traumatized by the experience. Some soldiers would vomit upon opening the rear doors and finding the contorted bodies, with expressions of frozen agony on their faces, their fingernails dug into the metal walls. Others refused to repeat the task. There were documented cases of severe alcoholism, nervous breakdowns, and suicides among the personnel in charge of operating the Gaswagen. But Himmler was not moved by the suffering of the victims. He was concerned about the efficiency of the system and the morale of his men. And he ordered a search for something better, something faster, something cleaner, something that would allow killing on a larger scale without the executioners having to look their victims in the eye. Thus, the extermination camps were born. And this is where the story reaches its darkest point, because what Himmler and Heydrich built next has no precedent in human history. It was not an act of war. It was not a spontaneous massacre. It was an industry designed exclusively to kill human beings with the greatest possible efficiency, using the same principles of assembly line production that Henry Ford had applied to the manufacturing of automobiles. Does that sound exaggerated? It is not. The Nazis literally studied industrial production methods to design their death factories. But before those factories began to operate, there was a meeting. The meeting. The one we mentioned at the beginning of this story, the Wannsee Conference. On January 20th, 1942, in an elegant villa located at 56 to 58 Am Großen Wannsee, on the shores of Lake Wannsee in southwestern Berlin, 15 high-ranking officials of the Nazi government and the SS gathered. The villa had been acquired by the Nordhav Foundation, an SS front, and served as a guest house and conference centre. It was a beautiful place, extensive gardens, lake views, interiors decorated with fine furniture and oil paintings, a postcard setting for the most monstrous decision in modern history. Reinhard Heydrich presided over the meeting. At his side sat Adolf Eichmann, the SS lieutenant colonel in charge of the logistics of the deportations, who would draft the official minutes of the conference. Among the attendees were state secretaries, representatives of the Ministries of Justice, Interior, Foreign Affairs, and the occupied Eastern Territories, as well as high-ranking commanders of the SS and the police. Neither Hitler nor Himmler were present, but both had given their approval to the plan Heydrich was about to present. The meeting began with Heydrich recalling that Hermann Göring had tasked him, through an order dated July 31st, 1941, with preparing a comprehensive plan for the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. Heydrich explained that, by order of the Führer, Jewish emigration, which had been the official policy until then, was no longer viable due to the war, and that a new solution had been adopted, the evacuation of the Jews to the east. The word evacuation was, of course, a euphemism. Everyone present knew exactly what it meant. Heydrich presented a detailed list of the Jewish population of each European country, a total of approximately 11 million people. The list included not only the countries already occupied by Germany, but also neutral countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, and even Great Britain and Ireland. It was a continental plan, a plan to eliminate all the Jews of Europe, without exception. According to the minutes drafted by Eichmann, Heydrich explained that the Jews would be evacuated to the east, where they would be employed in forced labour. Without a doubt, a large part will be eliminated by natural causes, Heydrich noted, with a coldness that chills the blood. Those who survive the labour, the remainder that is left in the end, which will undoubtedly be the most resistant part, would receive appropriate treatment, because otherwise they could become the seed of a new Jewish resurgence. Appropriate treatment meant murder. Everyone in the room knew it. The most disturbing thing about the Wannsee Conference was not what was said, but how it was said. According to Eichmann's later testimony during his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, the meeting was conducted in a surprisingly cordial tone. There were no heated debates. There were no moral objections. Not a single attendee raised their hand to say, "This is wrong." What there were technical discussions about logistics, about legal definitions of who was a Jew and who was a half-breed, about the difficulties of deporting Jews from certain Allied countries. It was, in essence, a work meeting, a meeting where civilized bureaucrats, many of them with doctorates in law, discussed the annihilation of an entire people while drinking cognac and coffee. The meeting lasted a mere 90 minutes to seal the fate of millions. After the conference, according to Eichmann, Heydrich was unusually relaxed. He poured himself a drink, lit a cigarette, and chatted animatedly with the attendees. He was satisfied. He had gotten what he wanted: the cooperation of all government ministries in the implementation of the final solution. The bureaucratic machinery of the Reich was now officially at the service of genocide. But the Wannsee Conference was not the beginning of the extermination. By January 1942, hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been murdered by the Einsatzgruppen in the occupied Soviet territories. The Chelmno extermination camp in occupied Poland had been operational since December 1941, using gas vans to murder Jews from the Lodz ghetto. What the Wannsee Conference did was to formalise, coordinate, and expand the genocide, to turn it from a series of scattered operations into a unified continental program, to provide it with the necessary bureaucratic infrastructure to function on the scale that Himmler and Heydrich had conceived. And that scale was colossal. In the months following Wannsee, the machinery of death was set in motion with terrifying speed and efficiency. New extermination camps were built, existing ones were expanded, and the railway transport networks that would carry millions of people to their deaths were organized. Operation Reinhard, so named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination in June 1942, was the code name for the plan to exterminate the Jews of the general government, the area of occupied Poland that had not been directly annexed to the Reich. The operation was led by Odilo Globoknik, a fanatical Austrian who served as the SS and police leader in the Lublin district, under the direct supervision of Himmler. 3 extermination camps were built specifically for Operation Reinhard: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These camps had a single function: to kill. They were not labor camps, not concentration camps in the conventional sense. They were pure death factories, designed to receive trains loaded with people, murder them in a matter of hours, and dispose of the bodies. Belzec, the first of the 3, began operating in March 1942. It was located in southeastern Poland, near the border with Ukraine, and had 3 gas chambers that used carbon monoxide generated by a tank engine. In its 10 months of operation, from March to December 1942, approximately 435,000 people were murdered in Belzec. 435,000 people in a single camp in 10 months. Sobibor, the second camp, began operating in May 1942 in eastern Poland. It had a similar structure to Belzec, gas chambers fed by engines that generated carbon monoxide. In Sobibor, at least 167,000 people were murdered, the majority of them Jews from Poland, the Netherlands, France, and the Soviet Union. But it was Treblinka that was the deadliest camp of Operation Reinhard. Located about 80 kilometers northeast of Warsaw, Treblinka II, as it was distinguished from the nearby labor camp, Treblinka I, began operating in July 1942. In that month, the mass deportations from the Warsaw ghetto began. Day after day, trains loaded with thousands of people left the Umschlagplatz, the ghetto's embarkation point for Treblinka. The journeys lasted hours, sometimes more than a day, in sealed cattle cars, without water, without food, without room to sit. Many died during the journey. Those who survived were received at Treblinka by guards with whips, who forced them to run down a fenced-in path, the tube, as the Nazis called it, or the path to heaven, as they called it, with macabre sarcasm, to the gas chambers. The entire process, from the arrival of the train to death, lasted between 2 and 3 hours. Approximately 925,000 people were murdered in Treblinka. It is the second place where the most Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, surpassed only by Auschwitz-Birkenau. In total, at least 1.75 million Jews were murdered during Operation Reinhard between 1942 and November 1943, when the camps were dismantled. The Nazis razed the facilities, burned the bodies that had been buried in mass graves, leveled the ground, and planted trees to hide all trace of what they had done. They wanted the world to never know what had happened there. They did not succeed. And Auschwitz deserves a chapter of its own, because Auschwitz was not just a camp, it was a complex, a universe of horror, with more than 40 subcamps that extended over an area of approximately 40 square kilometers in southern Poland. The Auschwitz complex had 3 main camps. Auschwitz I, the original camp, was established in June 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. Auschwitz II Birkenau, built from October 1941, became the largest extermination center of the Holocaust. And Auschwitz III Monowitz was a forced labor camp associated with the synthetic rubber factory of the IG Farben company. It was in Auschwitz that the most efficient murder method of the Holocaust was perfected: Zyklon B gas. Unlike the Operation Reinhard camps, which used carbon monoxide, Auschwitz employed hydrocyanic acid in the form of pellets that released lethal gas upon contact with the air. Zyklon B killed faster than carbon monoxide. A room full of people could be exterminated in 15 to 20 minutes. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, 4 large gas chamber and crematoria complexes were built, the so-called Crematorium 2, 3, 4, and 5, which at their peak of operation had the capacity to murder and cremate thousands of people daily. Estimates vary. Some sources speak of up to 6,000 people gassed per day, others of even higher figures during periods of peak activity, such as during the deportation of the Jews of Hungary in the spring and summer of 1944. Approximately 1 million Jews were murdered in Auschwitz, along with tens of thousands of Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and people of other nationalities. In total, more than 1.1 million people lost their lives in this complex. 1,100,000 people in a single place. How did the machinery of death work in Auschwitz? The process was designed to be fast, efficient, and as far as possible deceptive. When the trains arrived at the Birkenau ramp, the deportees were taken off and subjected to a selection carried out by SS doctors. Those who were considered fit for work, generally young and healthy men, were separated and sent to the camp. The rest, women, children, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, were sent directly to the gas chambers. In most transports, between 70 and 80% of the new arrivals were murdered within hours. The victims were told they were going to take a disinfection shower. They were ordered to undress and leave their belongings in an orderly fashion to be able to recover them later. They were given numbered hooks to hang their clothes. Everything was designed to maintain the illusion until the last moment. The gas chambers were designed to look like shower rooms, with shower heads on the ceiling that never worked. When the doors were closed and the Zyklon B pellets were thrown through the openings in the roof, the victims understood too late what was happening. The screams lasted for minutes, then silence. Afterward, the Sonderkommandos, groups of Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria under threat of immediate death, removed the bodies, extracted their gold teeth, cut the women's hair, and transported the corpses to the crematoria. The hair was sent to textile factories to make felt and cloth. The gold pieces were melted down and sent to the Reichsbank. The ashes from the crematoria were used as fertilizer or thrown into nearby rivers. Nothing was wasted, not even in death. How is it possible that human beings did this to other human beings? It is the question that has resonated for more than 8 decades, and that will probably never have a satisfactory answer. But let's return to Himmler and Heydrich. Because while this infernal machinery was being set in motion, the two architects of horror continued to expand their power. Heydrich, in particular, reached a position in 1941 that made him one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. On September 27, 1941, Hitler appointed him Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the territory that is today the Czech Republic. The titular protector, Konstantin von Neurath, had been considered too soft by Hitler, and Heydrich was sent to tighten control over the Czech population and increase industrial production for the war effort. What Heydrich did in Prague was a chilling demonstration of his method, a combination of ruthless terror and cold pragmatism. In his first weeks as protector, he declared martial law and unleashed a wave of brutal repression. Hundreds of people were arrested and summarily executed. Leaders of the Czech resistance, intellectuals, politicians, military officers, all fell under Heydrich's boot. The Prime Minister of the Protectorate, Alois Elias, who had been secretly collaborating with the resistance, was condemned to death. But Heydrich did not limit himself to terror. He also implemented improvements in the working conditions of Czech industrial workers, increased food rations, introduced social insurance, and organised cultural events for the working class. Why? Not out of generosity, but out of calculation. Heydrich knew that a well-fed worker produced more than a hungry one, and industrial production was vital for the German war effort. The Czechs had to be terrorised, so they would not rebel, but they also had to be productive enough to be useful. It was the logic of a man who saw human beings as resources to be managed, not as people. This dual strategy, the stick and the carrot, terror and seduction, was devastatingly effective. The Czech resistance was virtually dismantled, industrial production increased significantly, and Heydrich earned the nickname the Butcher of Prague among the Czechs, who feared and hated him in equal measure. But that very effectiveness signed his death sentence. The Czechoslovak government in exile, led by Edvard Beneš from London, understood that Heydrich represented an existential threat not only to the Czech resistance, but to the very national identity of the Czech people. If Heydrich continued in his post, he could achieve the complete Germanization of Bohemia and Moravia in a generation. He had to be eliminated, and so Operation Anthropoid was born, one of the most audacious and tragic assassination missions of the Second World War. Could two men with improvised weapons and limited training assassinate the most dangerous man in the Third Reich in the heart of his territory? And what consequences would that act have for millions of innocent people? The answer to that question is as heroic as it is heartbreaking. Operation Anthropoid was planned by the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, in collaboration with the Czechoslovak government in exile. Two Czech soldiers, Warrant Officer Josef Gabčík, a 29-year-old Slovak, and Warrant Officer Jan Kubis, a 28-year-old Moravian, were selected for the mission. Both had fled Czechoslovakia after the German occupation and had joined the Czechoslovak army in exile. They were trained in Great Britain in sabotage, hand-to-hand combat, and the use of weapons and explosives. On the night of December 28th to 29th, 1941, Gabčík and Kubis were parachuted into the Protectorate. They landed far from the planned area, near the village of Nevězdy, east of Prague. Despite initial difficulties, the cold, disorientation, the need to hide from German patrols, they managed to reach Prague, where they were taken in by members of the Czech resistance, who provided them with false documents, lodging, and the necessary information about Heydrich's movements. For months, Gabčík and Kubis studied Heydrich's routine. They observed his movements between his residence at Panenské Brezny Castle, north of Prague, and his office at Prague Castle. Heydrich travelled every morning in an open-top Mercedes-Benz, without an armoured escort with a single driver. It was a revealing detail of his arrogance. Heydrich believed that no Czech would dare to attack him. He felt invulnerable. He was not. On May 27th, 1942, at 10:30 in the morning, Gabčík and Kubis waited at a sharp curve on the road that descended from the Liban district toward the centre of Prague. It was the ideal place for an ambush. Heydrich's car had to slow down to take the curve. When the Mercedes appeared, Gabčík stood in front of the vehicle and aimed his Sten submachine gun. He pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. In that instant, instead of ordering his driver to accelerate, Heydrich made the mistake that cost him his life. He ordered the car to stop and stood up in his seat to shoot at Gabčík with his pistol. At that moment, Kubis threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded next to the car's right rear wheel. The explosion tore off part of the car's body and projected fragments of metal and seat fibers into Heydrich's body. What followed was chaotic. Heydrich, wounded but still on his feet, pursued his attackers, firing at them for a few meters before collapsing. Gabčík and Kubis fled in opposite directions. Heydrich was taken to Bulovka Hospital, where doctors discovered he had fragments of metal, horsehair, and wire embedded in his spleen and diaphragm. He underwent emergency surgery. Himmler sent his personal physician, Karl Gebhardt, from Berlin along with the best SS surgeon. At first, it seemed that Heydrich would recover. It was not to be. On June 4th, 1942, 8 days after the attack, Reinhard Heydrich died at the age of 38. The official cause was septicemia, a generalized infection caused by the fragments that had penetrated his body. Some historians have speculated that the fragments were poisoned with botulinum toxin, but this theory has never been conclusively confirmed. The blonde beast was dead. The Nazi regime's reaction was as predictable as it was devastating. Hitler flew into a rage. Himmler swore revenge, and the revenge was terrible. On June 10th, 1942, just 6 days after Heydrich's death, SS troops surrounded the village of Lidice, about 20 kilometers northwest of Prague. The Nazis had received reports, false as would later be proven, that the inhabitants of Lidice had collaborated with the parachutists. What followed was one of the most notorious atrocities of the war. All men over 15 years old, 173 in total, were taken from their homes and shot in the garden of the Horak family farm. The women, 184, were deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children, 105, were separated from their mothers. A few, considered racially valuable by the Nazis, were sent to German families to be Germanized. The rest, 82 children, were sent to the Chelmno extermination camp, where they were murdered in gas vans. The village was set on fire, demolished, and leveled. The rubble was removed. The course of the stream was diverted. Even the cemetery was razed. The Nazis wanted Lidice to cease to exist, its name to be erased from the map, for not a single brick, headstone, or memory to remain. They did not succeed. The name Lidice became a worldwide symbol of Nazi barbarism. Cities in Brazil, Mexico, the United States, and Israel were renamed in honor of the destroyed village. 2 weeks later, on June 24th, the village of Lizaki suffered a similar fate. 33 adults were executed, the children deported, and the village razed. Meanwhile, Gabčík, Kubis, and 5 other parachutists who had participated in different missions took refuge in the crypt of the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius, in the center of Prague. On June 18th, following a betrayal, a member of the resistance, Karol Kurda, revealed their location in exchange for a reward. 750 SS soldiers surrounded the church. The 7 men resisted for hours, armed with pistols and grenades, against an entire army. When the Nazis tried to flood the crypt by pumping water from a nearby fire hydrant, the parachutists understood there was no escape. They used their last bullets to take their own lives. None were captured alive. Those 7 men died as heroes, but their sacrifice came at a terrible price. The Nazi reprisal for Heydrich's assassination claimed the lives of approximately 5,000 people in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Members of the resistance, their families, their friends, people who had sheltered them, people who were simply under suspicion, all were swept away by the wave of terror. Was it worth it? It is a question that still generates debate among historians today. Operation Anthropoid eliminated one of the most dangerous men of the Nazi regime, but it provoked massive reprisals against the civilian population. However, the act of resistance sent a powerful message to the world. Nazism was not invincible. Its leaders could be reached. And for Himmler, Heydrich's death was a devastating personal blow. He lost his most capable subordinate, his right-hand man, the man who had turned his plans into reality. At Heydrich's state funeral, held in Berlin on June 9th, 1942, Himmler delivered a speech in which he described Heydrich as a man with an iron heart and called him one of the best National Socialists, one of the strongest defenders of the idea of the German Reich. Hitler posthumously awarded Heydrich the German Order, the party's highest distinction. But the apparatus did not stop. The machinery of death did not depend on a single man. Himmler appointed Ernst Kaltenbrunner, an Austrian SS lawyer, with a prominent scar on his cheek and a reputation for brutality that rivaled Heydrich's own, as the new head of the RSHA. Kaltenbrunner was less sophisticated than Heydrich, less intelligent according to many of his contemporaries, but he was equally ruthless, and under his direction, the final solution continued at full speed. In fact, the months following Heydrich's death were the deadliest of the Holocaust. In the summer and autumn of 1942, mass deportations to the extermination camps reached their peak. Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor operated at full capacity. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, the gas chambers and crematoria ran without pause. The Jewish communities of Poland, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Norway, Greece, Yugoslavia, Slovakia, and other countries were systematically deported and murdered. The scale of the transport was itself a logistical operation of enormous proportions. The Reich's railway network was used to transport millions of people to the extermination camps. The trains were organized with the same bureaucracy as any other rail service: schedules, routes, fares. Yes, fares. The Reichsbahn, the Reich's railway company, charged the SSA price per person transported, the third-class fare for adults, and half for children under 10. Children under 4 travelled free. They travelled in sealed cattle cars, crowded to the point of suffocation, without water, without food, without a bucket for physiological needs. Many died during the journey, especially in the summer months when the temperatures inside the cars reached lethal levels. It was the bureaucracy of evil in its purest form: forms, stamps, invoices, and receipts for the transport of human beings to their deaths. Adolf Eichmann, the SS lieutenant colonel who coordinated the logistics of the deportations from his office in Berlin, was the central cog in this machinery. Eichmann was not a fanatical ideologue or a violent sadist. He was, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt would describe him decades later in her famous book Eichmann in Jerusalem, the embodiment of the banality of evil, a mediocre bureaucrat who carried out orders efficiently, without questioning them, without reflecting on their moral significance. He organised the death trains with the same diligence with which he might have organised the transport of goods. For him, the Jews were not people, they were figures in a chart, logistical problems to be solved, cargo to be transported. And ordinary Germans, did they know what was happening? This is another of the great questions of Holocaust history, and the answer is uncomfortable. They knew more than they admitted after the war, much more. Trains loaded with Jews crossed Germany in plain sight. Railway workers saw the sealed cars and heard the screams. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Front told what they had seen: mass shootings, mass graves, razed villages. Letters from the front, though censored, contained hints that anyone could decipher. The public speeches of Nazi leaders were explicit. Hitler declared in a speech to the Reichstag on January 30th, 1939, that if international Jewish financiers provoked another world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. He did not say deportation, he said annihilation, and he said it publicly, before thousands of people and millions of radio listeners. Himmler, for his part, was even more explicit in private. In a speech to SS generals in Posen, today Poznan, in Poland, on October 4th, 1943, Himmler spoke openly about the extermination of the Jews. His words were recorded and are preserved to this day. I want to speak to you with all frankness on a very grave matter. Among ourselves, we can mention it openly, though we will never speak of it in public. I am referring to the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. It is one of those things that are easily said. The Jewish people are being exterminated, says every party member. Naturally, it's in our program. The elimination of the Jews, the extermination, we're doing it. And then they all come, 80 million good Germans, and each one has his decent Jew. Of course, the others are pigs, but this one is a first-class Jew. Himmler continued, "Of all those who speak thus, none has witnessed what it means. None has been present. Most of you will know what it means when 100 corpses lie together, or 500, or 1,000. To have endured this, and at the same time, apart from exceptions of human weakness, to have remained decent, that is what has hardened us. This is a glorious page in our history that has never been written and never will be written." Those words are perhaps the most chilling testimony that exists about the mindset of the Holocaust perpetrators. Himmler was not describing a secret. He was describing something that 80 million good Germans knew but preferred not to see, and he was proud of it, proud of the decency of his murderers. What kind of world produces men who consider the murder of millions decent? But the figures of horror did not stop there, because the Holocaust was not limited to the Jews, although they were its main and most numerous victims. The Nazi regime also systematically persecuted and murdered other groups. The Roma and Sinti, the Gypsies, as they were pejoratively called, suffered what in their language is known as the porajmos, the devouring. It is estimated that between 250,000 and 500,000 Roma were murdered by the Nazis and their allies during the war. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, there was a gypsy camp, the Zigeunerlager, where entire Roma families were interned before being exterminated. On the night of August 2nd to 3rd, 1944, the SS liquidated the gypsy camp. 2,897 Roma men, women, and children were sent to the gas chambers in a single night. Soviet prisoners of war were another massively victimized group. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, at least 3.3 million died in captivity from hunger, disease, executions, forced labor, or the brutal conditions of the prisoner of war camps. It is a victim figure that is often overlooked, but it represents one of the greatest atrocities of the war. Physically and mentally disabled Germans were the first victims of the Nazi mass murder program, the program known as Aktion T4, which took its name from the address of its central office in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4, was implemented from October 1939 under the direct supervision of the Führer's chancellery. At least 70,000 disabled people were murdered in 6 euthanasia centres by lethal injection or gas. The program was officially suspended in August 1941 following protests by the Catholic Bishop Clemens August von Galen. But the murders continued covertly in hospitals and asylums until the end of the war, raising the total number of victims to about 250,000 people. And here is a direct connection to the Holocaust that is often underestimated. It was in the euthanasia centres of the T4 program that the Nazis developed and perfected the gas-killing techniques that would later be applied on a massive scale in the extermination camps. The same officials who had run the euthanasia centres, men like Christian Werf, Franz Stangl, and Kurt Franz, were transferred to Operation Reinhard to run the camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The experience gained from killing disabled Germans was applied to the murder of millions of Jews. There was a direct line, a red thread that connected both programs, and that thread passed through the hands of Himmler. Homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political opponents, Freemasons, Slavs, all were victims of the Nazi regime to varying degrees. The concentration camp system, which in 1945 comprised more than 42,500 facilities of various types scattered throughout Europe, did not discriminate in its capacity to cause suffering. But let's return to Himmler, because this man's story did not end with Heydrich's death. In fact, after the disappearance of the blonde beast, Himmler concentrated even more power in his hands. Throughout 1943 and 1944, he accumulated positions and responsibilities at a dizzying pace. In August 1943, he was appointed Reich Minister of the Interior, which gave him control over the entire civil administration of Germany. After the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20th, 1944, Operation Valkyrie, in which Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb at the Führer's headquarters in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Himmler was appointed commander of the Reserve Army, which gave him authority over all military forces within Germany. He was even appointed commander of an army group on the Vistula front in January 1945, a position for which he was grotesquely unfit. Himmler, who had never fired a shot in combat, who grew faint at the sight of blood, suddenly found himself in command of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in a desperate situation. Why did Hitler give him these positions? Because after July 20th, the Führer no longer trusted anyone except the most loyal fanatics. And Himmler, despite all his flaws as a military man, was, or at least Hitler believed he was, unconditionally loyal. But Himmler was no longer loyal, not entirely, because as the war became clearly lost, as the Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviets from the east, as German cities turned to rubble under aerial bombardments, Himmler began to do something unthinkable: secretly negotiate with the Western Allies. Through intermediaries, mainly the Swedish Count Volker Bernadotte, Vice President of the Swedish Red Cross, and Walter Schellenberg, the head of the SS's foreign intelligence, Himmler initiated contacts with the Allies in early 1945. His proposal was astonishing in its delusion. He offered to surrender to the Western Allies, but not to the Soviets, and to place the SS at the disposal of the West to fight against communism. In return, he expected to be treated as a legitimate interlocutor, perhaps even as the future leader of a post-Nazi Germany that would collaborate with the West against the Soviet Union. Did Himmler really believe that the Allies would agree to negotiate with the man responsible for the Holocaust? Apparently, yes. That disconnection from reality says a lot about Himmler's mind in the final months of the war. He was a man who had spent 12 years building an empire of terror, and who was now trying to reinvent himself as a diplomat, as a statesman, as a partner of the Western democracies. The megalomania and self-justification had reached levels bordering on the pathological. The Allies, of course, rejected any negotiation, and when Hitler learned of Himmler's contacts with Bernadotte in late April 1945, he erupted in an apocalyptic fury. In his bunker under the Chancellery in Berlin, surrounded by the rubble of his 1,000-year Reich that had not lasted 13, Hitler denounced Himmler as a traitor and expelled him from all his offices. Hermann Göring had already suffered a similar fate days before. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. 2 days later, Berlin fell to the Red Army. On May 7th, Germany signed their unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. And Himmler, the man who had controlled the greatest terror apparatus in history, tried to flee. He shaved his moustache, put on an eye patch, and a private's uniform with false papers in the name of Heinrich Hitziner. Along with a small group of assistants, he tried to cross Allied lines and disappear. He did not succeed. On May 21st, 1945, Himmler and his companions were arrested by a British patrol at a checkpoint near Bremervord in northern Germany. At first, the British did not recognize Himmler, but during the interrogation, Himmler revealed his identity. Some historians believe he did so voluntarily, still hoping to negotiate with the British. He was transferred to the British intelligence headquarters in Nuremberg, where he was subjected to a medical examination. During the examination, the doctor asked Himmler to open his mouth. Himmler obeyed, and in that instant, he bit a cyanide capsule he had hidden in a molar. The British tried to save his life. They put their fingers down his throat, induced vomiting, pumped his stomach, but it was useless. Heinrich Himmler died on May 23rd, 1945, at the age of 44. He died like a coward, evading the justice that should have judged him for the most monstrous crimes in history. His body was buried in secret in an undisclosed location near Nuremberg. There is no grave, no headstone, no monument, only anonymous earth for the man who sent millions to anonymous graves. And Heydrich, His legacy did not die with him in Prague in 1942. The machinery he built continued to run with the precision of a clock for 3 more years, claiming millions of additional lives. The extermination camps that bore his name, Operation Reinhard, consumed more than 1.75 million people before being dismantled, and the RSHA he created continued to coordinate the genocide until the last days of the war. But beyond the numbers, beyond the dates, and the names, there is something in this story that should deeply disturb us, and it is that Himmler and Heydrich were not aberrations. They were not monsters from another world. They were products of a society, of a system, of an era. Himmler was the son of an educated middle class, religious, order-loving family. Heydrich was a talented musician, an athlete, a naval officer. Neither was born a mass murderer. They became one, and the path they travelled, from normality to monstrosity, is a path that, under the right circumstances, others could travel too. That is what makes this story so important. It is not just a tale of the past, it is a warning for the future. Was it hate? Was it power? Was it strategy? Heydrich was the operational brain, the hand that signed the orders, the eye that watched every corner of the Reich. Without Heydrich, the SD would have been a mediocre intelligence service, one agency among many. With him, it became the most sophisticated instrument of control that has ever existed in a modern state. But at the same time, Himmler knew that Heydrich was dangerous. Not because he was disloyal. Heydrich carried out orders with impeccable efficiency, but because he was too ambitious, too intelligent, too capable. And in a system where power was measured by proximity to the Führer, Heydrich was ascending at a speed that threatened to leave Himmler himself behind. When Hitler appointed Heydrich Deputy Protector of Bohemia and Moravia in September 1941, it was an unequivocal signal. The Führer saw in Heydrich an exceptional administrator, perhaps even a future leader of the Reich. Himmler understood it, and he did not like it. There is a detail that few know, a detail that reveals the true nature of the relationship between these two men. Heydrich had a file, a personal file, separate from the official SD files, which he kept under lock and key in a safe in his Berlin office. In that file, according to post-war testimonies from several RSHA officials, Heydrich collected compromising information on the most prominent members of the Nazi regime, including Himmler himself. Financial secrets, extramarital affairs, dubious connections, ideological contradictions, everything was recorded in those folders. Heydrich understood better than anyone that information was the most valuable currency of the Third Reich, and he was accumulating a treasure. Did Himmler know about the existence of that file? Probably. Walter Schellenberg, who succeeded Heydrich as head of foreign intelligence, claimed after the war that Himmler lived in a state of constant tension with respect to Heydrich because he suspected, rightly so, that his subordinate possessed material that could be used against him at any moment. And so, an uncomfortable question arises from the shadows of history, a question that some historians have raised, and that others have dismissed as irresponsible speculation, but which still haunts the corridors of the declassified archives. Did Himmler, in some dark corner of his mind, wish for Heydrich's death? There is no proof that Himmler participated in Operation Anthropoid. There is no proof that he betrayed Heydrich's location or sabotaged his security. But it is a documented fact that Heydrich travelled around Prague in an open-top car, without an armoured escort, in a city where the resistance was active and where Allied intelligence services operated with growing audacity. Did no one in the SS security apparatus warn of the risk? Did no one suggest additional protection measures for the third most powerful man in the Reich? The negligence is, to say the least, suspicious. When Heydrich died, Himmler wept in public. He delivered moving speeches. He organised a grandiose state funeral. But at the same time, he seized Heydrich's files, and he never appointed a successor of the same calibre. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the man who took over the leadership of the RSHA, was brutal but mediocre. Exactly the type of subordinate that Himmler could control without worries. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in the Third Reich, coincidences were a luxury that few could afford. What would have happened if Heydrich had survived the attack? Would he have ended up confronting Himmler? Would he have replaced Hitler if the war had been prolonged? Some historians, like Robert Gerwaff, have speculated that Heydrich, had he lived, could have become Hitler's natural successor, a possibility that should have terrified the world even more than the reality itself. Because if Hitler was the demagogue and Himmler the bureaucrat, Heydrich was both and much more. A charismatic leader, a brilliant administrator, a ruthless strategist, and a man without the slightest trace of human compassion. But history does not allow for retroactive hypotheses. What happened, happened. And what happened after Heydrich's death was the most lethal phase of the Holocaust. Now we need to stop. We need to get out of the offices of Berlin, out of the SS headquarters, out of the conference rooms where death sentences were signed. We need to go down to the street level, to the level of the people who lived and died under the regime that Himmler and Heydrich built. Because this story cannot be told only from the top. It must also be told from the bottom, from the victims, from the witnesses, from those who saw the horror up close and survived to tell it. What was it really like to live under the terror of the SS? What did a Jewish family feel when they heard the knock on the door at 3 a.m? What went through a prisoner's mind as they descended from the cattle car onto the Auschwitz ramp and saw the smoking chimneys? There is a testimony, one among millions, but one that captures with devastating clarity what it meant to be a victim of Himmler and Heydrich's plan. His name was Philip Müller. He was a Slovak Jew from Sered, born in 1922. He was deported to Auschwitz in April 1942 at the age of 20, and by one of those atrocious coincidences that only the history of the Holocaust can produce, he was assigned to the Sonderkommando, the group of prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria. Philip Müller spent almost 3 years at the very heart of the extermination machinery. He saw what no human being should ever have to see, and he survived. In his testimony, collected in Claude Lanzmann's documentary Shoah, and in his own memoir, Müller described the process of murder in Auschwitz, with a detail that is impossible to read without feeling something break inside. He described how deportees arrived in sealed trains, after journeys that lasted for days, without water, without food, without space to move. He described how upon opening the cars, SS guards shouted orders while dogs barked and searchlight beams cut through the darkness. He described the selection on the ramp, the SS doctors pointing with their finger to the right, to the left, to life, to death, in a process that lasted seconds and decided the fate of entire families. He described how those selected to die were told they were going to take a disinfection shower, how they undressed in changing rooms with numbered hooks and wooden benches, how they entered the gas chambers, believing they would come out clean on the other side. And he described what happened next, when the doors were closed and the Zyklon B pellets fell through the openings in the roof. The gas began to take effect in a matter of minutes. The victims, realizing what was happening, panicked. The strongest climbed over the weakest, trying to reach the air that remained near the ceiling. When the members of the Sonderkommando opened the doors after the ventilators had extracted the gas, they found the bodies piled in a human pyramid. The weakest, children, the elderly, the sick, crushed at the bottom, and the strongest on top, their nails dug into the flesh of others, their eyes bulging, their mouths open in a scream that no one could hear anymore. The Zyklon B pellets proved to be the fastest gassing method and became the chosen means of mass murder for Auschwitz, where at its peak, up to 6,000 Jews were gassed per day. Philip Müller described how the Sonderkommandos had to separate the intertwined bodies, extract gold teeth with pliers, cut the women's hair, and transport the corpses to the crematoria. and he described how, on one occasion, he recognized among the bodies people from his own hometown, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, faces he had seen 1,000 times on the streets of Sered, and that now lay twisted and blue on the floor of a gas chamber in Poland. How does one not go mad at that? How does one go on living after having seen that? Müller tried to commit suicide. On one occasion, he voluntarily entered the gas chamber with a group of victims, determined to die with them, but a group of Czech women pushed him out, telling him that he had to live to tell the world what had happened there. Your duty is to survive, they told him, and he survived. That testimony, that fragment of humanity amid absolute horror, reminds us of something that Himmler and Heydrich tried to destroy but could not: human dignity. Even on the threshold of death, those women thought of the future, of the truth, of justice, of memory. But there is another dimension to this story that we need to explore, a dimension that makes the horror even more incomprehensible, if that is possible. The perpetrators, not the leaders. We already know Himmler and Heydrich, but the ordinary men who carried out their orders, those who pulled the triggers at Babi Yar, those who threw the Zyklon B through the openings in the roof at Auschwitz, those who drove the death trains, those who signed the papers, who stamped the forms, who calculated the railway routes. Were they all monsters? Were they all psychopaths? Were they all fanatical anti-Semites? The answer, disturbingly, is no. The majority were ordinary men, fathers, workers, citizens who before the war led perfectly normal lives, and who after the war went back to leading them. The historian Christopher Browning documented this phenomenon in his study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a police unit composed of middle-aged men from Hamburg, too old for regular military service, that was sent to Poland in 1942 to participate in mass shootings and deportations. Of the approximately 500 men in the battalion, only a dozen refused to participate in the massacres when their commander offered them that option. The rest shot. Browning concluded that peer pressure, obedience to authority, group conformity, and the progressive dehumanization of the victims were more decisive factors than ideology or personal hatred. The gas vans were, according to historian Christopher Browning, precisely a technological solution to the perceived problem of the psychological burden on the killers. The aim was not to reduce the suffering of the victims, it was to protect the emotional stability of the executioners. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, testified at the Nuremberg trials that the Führer's order had to be carried out in the most humane way possible, a perversion of the concept of humanity that reveals the depth of the regime's moral distortion. That is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of this entire story. It was not a handful of madmen who carried out the Holocaust. It was a system in which millions of people participated, each contributing their small grain of sand. The official who processed the deportation papers, the train driver who drove the train, the chemist who manufactured the Zyklon B, the banker who administered the gold stolen from the victims, the neighbor who denounced his Jewish neighbor to the Gestapo. Each of them was a cog in the machinery of death, and most of them did not consider themselves murderers. Himmler knew it. He said it with brutal frankness in his Posen speech on October 4th, 1943, when he addressed his SS generals about the annihilation of the Jewish people and declared that this glorious page in our history has never been written and never will be written again, and that we had the moral right, we were obligated to our people to kill these people who wanted to kill us. In that same speech, Himmler mentioned that 80 million good Germans knew what was happening, but that each had their decent Jew, the neighbor, the doctor, the merchant they considered an exception, while accepting the destruction of the rest. That phrase is perhaps the most precise portrait of the collective complicity that made the Holocaust possible. But let's pause here for a moment, because there is an aspect of Himmler and Heydrich's planning that is often overlooked and that reveals an even more chilling facet of their vision. They did not just want to destroy, they also wanted to build. Build what? A new racial order. A Europe reorganized according to biological criteria. A continent where only the races that the Nazis considered valuable existed, and where the others had been eliminated, enslaved, or expelled. The General Plan Ost, the General Plan for the East, was the most ambitious and monstrous project of that vision. The General Plan Ost was developed between 1940 and 1943 by the SS Race and Settlement Main Office under Himmler's supervision. It was, in essence, a master plan for the German colonization of Eastern Europe, and its numbers were demented. The plan called for the expulsion, enslavement, or extermination of between 30 and 50 million people in Poland, the Soviet Union, the Baltic countries, and the Balkans. Slavs, Jews, Roma. Entire peoples would be removed to make way for German settlers. New cities, new roads, new farms, new factories were planned, all under the control of the SS, all administered by the racial elite that Himmler was breeding in his Lebensborn, the fountains of life, institutions where racially pure women were encouraged to have children with SS members to produce a new generation of super-Aryans. The General Plan Ost was not fully implemented due to the course of the war, but its elements were partially applied in the occupied territories, mass deportations, the destruction of villages, the forced resettlement of populations, the experiments of Germanizing, Polish children kidnapped from their families. All of this was part of Himmler's vision for the new order. How many children were stolen? The figures are uncertain, but it is estimated that between 50,000 and 200,000 Polish children were taken from their families and sent to Germany to be Germanized. They were given German names, placed in German families, or in Lebensborn institutions, and were forbidden to speak Polish or remember their origin. After the war, only a fraction of those children were returned to their families. Many never knew who they really were. Some discovered the truth decades later, already elderly, and lived the rest of their lives with the burden of a stolen identity. That is what Himmler understood by building, not the construction of a better world, the construction of a world where only one race, one culture, one vision existed, a world emptied of diversity, of humanity, of everything that makes civilization worthy of the name. And Heydrich was the instrument of that destructive construction, because Heydrich did not just persecute Jews, he persecuted anyone who did not fit the mold. In the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, he implemented a program of racial classification of the Czech population. Teams of SS anthropologists measured skulls, analyzed facial features, took blood samples, and classified each individual into categories. Those who were Germanizable, Aryan enough to be absorbed by the Reich, and those who were not. The former would be assimilated, the latter would be deported, enslaved, or eliminated. It was social engineering taken to its most monstrous expression, the attempt to redesign the racial composition of an entire continent as if human beings were pieces of a puzzle that could be moved, discarded, or destroyed at will. What was the logic behind all this? Did Himmler and Heydrich really believe their project was viable? Or did they know, on some level, that they were pursuing a delirious fantasy? The evidence suggests that Himmler, at least, sincerely believed in the viability of his project. His private speeches, his memorandums, his instructions to subordinates, everything indicates that he saw the racial restructuring of Europe as a sacred historical mission that the SS was destined to fulfill. Himmler believed that racial purity guaranteed the survival of the Reich for 1,000 years, and that, under that logic, eliminating the Jews was not a crime, but a biological necessity. Heydrich, for his part, was more pragmatic. There is no evidence that he shared Himmler's mystical fantasies, the runes, Wewelsburg Castle, the Ahnenerbe, and its expeditions to Tibet. What Heydrich did share was the conviction that the power of the SS should expand to encompass all spheres of life in the Reich and in the occupied territories. Both Himmler and Heydrich aspired to demonstrate that the SS could administer territories inside and outside the Reich more effectively than the civil bureaucrats or military officers, whom they expected to supplant with the SS elite after the German victory. Racial ideology was the vehicle, power was the destination. And that brings us back to the question that titles this story: hate, power, or strategy? Let's review what we know. Hate existed. Himmler, head of the SS, saw history as a struggle between races, where the German people had to free themselves from everything he considered impure. For him, the Jews represented the origin of moral corruption, of communism, of capitalism, and of cultural decadence. Himmler did not simulate his anti-Semitism. He lived it as a profound conviction, a lens through which he interpreted all of human history. Every misfortune of Germany, every economic crisis, every military defeat, everything was the fault of the Jews, according to Himmler's paranoid cosmology. Heydrich is more difficult to decipher. His anti-Semitism may have been genuine or instrumental. Heydrich, trained in the Navy and with a calculating mind, applied that doctrine with military precision. His efficiency in persecution did not necessarily require personal conviction. Ambition was enough. But there are indications that Heydrich developed a genuine hatred for the Jews, fueled perhaps by the trauma of his childhood taunts and the need to prove, again and again, that he was not what his schoolmates called him. Power was the fuel that fed the entire system. Himmler built a personal empire within the Reich. The SS controlled the police, the concentration camps, the elite military units, the intelligence services, the forced labor companies, the colonization programs, the racial research. It was a state within a state, with its own army, its own police, its own economy, its own ideology. And each step in the persecution of the Jews, from the Nuremberg laws to the Wannsee Conference, increased the power of the SS and therefore the power of Himmler. Heydrich, likewise, used each new responsibility as a springboard to more power, from the leadership of the SD to the direction of the RSHA, from the coordination of the Einsatzgruppen to the administration of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Each step brought him closer to the core of Nazi power. Even while planning the elements of what would become the exterminatory aspect of the Holocaust, Heydrich saw other areas in which to secure the predominance of the SS in Nazi Germany. And strategy was the method. The final solution was not an outburst of irrational violence. It was a plan conceived with bureaucratic coldness, implemented with logistical precision, and executed with industrial efficiency. The implementation and coordination of the final solution was established on January 20th, 1942, in a meeting of high-ranking SS officers and German government officials. It was presented as a rational solution to a problem that the regime had defined ideologically. The Jews were not murdered in a fit of madness. They were murdered because someone sat in an office, studied the numbers, drew up the plans, organized the transports, built the facilities, and calculated the costs, and that someone was ultimately Himmler, with Heydrich as his main executor. Hate, power, and strategy. The three things at once, inseparable, feeding each other in a deadly cycle. But there is something more, something that transcends these two men and affects the entire structure of the Third Reich, something that explains why the plan worked with such devastating effectiveness. And it is the system, because Himmler and Heydrich could not have done what they did without the active or passive collaboration of millions of people. Government officials who processed the deportation papers, businessmen who benefited from the slave labor of prisoners, scientists who participated in the experiments, doctors who performed the selections on the camp ramps, judges who applied the racial laws, teachers who taught Nazi ideology in schools, journalists who spread the propaganda, neighbors who denounced their neighbors. The SS and police authorities designated certain categories of prisoners to be annihilated through labor. These prisoners literally worked their lives away. That is, they were put to work under conditions that directly and deliberately led to illness, injury, and death. And these conditions were not secret. The businessmen who used forced labor from the camps, I.G. Farben, Krupp, Simons, BMW, among many others, knew perfectly well what was happening. They knew that their workers were enslaved prisoners, that they were dying at an alarming rate, and that they were being replaced by new transports from the ghettos and occupied countries. They knew, and they continued to profit. Officials from the German Ministry of Justice sent approximately 20,000 convicted persons to the SS to be annihilated through labor. In 4 months, more than 2/3 of these prisoners had been forced to work to death. That was not the work of Himmler alone. It was the work of an entire system, of an entire state, of an entire society that to a greater or lesser extent participated, tolerated, or looked the other way. And the international community, did the rest of the world know what was happening? Yes, it knew. Not with all the details, not with the precision we would have after the war, but it knew. From 1942 onwards, the Allied governments received increasingly detailed reports on the extermination of European Jews. Jan Karski, a Polish resistance agent, infiltrated the Warsaw Ghetto and a transit camp, and then travelled to London and Washington to personally inform Churchill and Roosevelt about what he had seen. They believed him, but they did not act. They did not bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz. They did not bomb the gas chambers. They did not open their borders to Jewish refugees. They did nothing specific to stop the genocide until the military defeat of Germany stopped it by itself. Why? That is another of the questions that haunt the conscience of humanity. And the answer, uncomfortable but honest, is that stopping the Holocaust was not a strategic priority for the Allies. Winning the war was. And in the cold logic of military strategy, the resources dedicated to bombing Auschwitz would have been resources taken away from other operations considered more important for final victory. Himmler knew it. He knew that the world was looking the other way, and he acted accordingly. But not everything was complicity and silence. There was resistance. There were people who refused to accept the horror, people who risked, and often lost, their lives to save others. In the Warsaw Ghetto, in April 1943, a group of young Jews armed with pistols, homemade bombs, and Molotov cocktails rose up against the SS troops, who came to deport the last inhabitants of the ghetto to Treblinka. The uprising, led by Mordecai Anielewicz, just 24 years old, lasted almost a month. It was brutally crushed by the SS, under the command of General Jürgen Stroop, who burned the ghetto building by building. The Jewish fighters knew they could not win, but they fought anyway, not to survive, but to die with dignity, to show that they would not submit like lambs to the slaughter, so that the world would know that there were Jews who fought. In Sobibor, on October 14th, 1943, the prisoners rebelled. Led by Alexander Pechersky, a Jewish officer of the Red Army, they killed 11 SS guards and fled into the forests. Of the approximately 600 prisoners in the camp, about 300 managed to escape. Most were recaptured and murdered in the following days and weeks, but about 50 survived the war. The Sobibor camp was dismantled by the Nazis immediately after the revolt, for fear it would be repeated. In Treblinka, on August 2nd, 1943, the Sonderkommando prisoners also rebelled. They managed to seize the camp's arsenal and opened fire on the guards. Approximately 300 prisoners escaped, although most were captured and murdered. About 70 survived the war. And outside the camps and ghettos, there were people who saved lives with extraordinary courage. Oskar Schindler, the German businessman who protected more than 1,200 Jews by employing them in his factories. Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who distributed protection passports to thousands of Jews in Budapest. Irina Sendler, the Polish social worker who smuggled 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, hiding them in orphanages, convents, and homes of Polish families. The inhabitants of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a Protestant village in the south of France that sheltered thousands of Jews throughout the occupation. The diplomats from several neutral countries, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Turkey, who issued protection visas to Jewish refugees, often disobeying the instructions of their own governments. These stories of resistance and rescue are small lights in the immensity of the darkness. They do not change the figures. 6 million Jews murdered, 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. But they remind us that even in the worst circumstances, even under the most brutal regime the world has ever known, there were people who chose humanity over barbarism, who refused to be complicit, who risked everything to save a stranger. And that, ultimately, is what differentiates those people from Himmler and Heydrich. They were not braver. They were not more intelligent. They simply chose differently. They chose compassion when the whole system asked for indifference. They chose action when the easiest thing was to look the other way. Now, there is a final chapter in Himmler's story that reveals, as few things can, the cowardice hidden behind all his monstrosity. We have already mentioned it briefly. In the final months of the war, when defeat was inevitable, Himmler tried to negotiate with the Western Allies. But the details of those negotiations are even more revealing than it might seem. In early 1945, Himmler authorized the release of a limited number of prisoners from concentration camps, allowing the Swedish Red Cross to evacuate thousands of Scandinavian and Jewish prisoners in the so-called white buses of Count Volker Bernadotte. Why? Not out of compassion, out of calculation. Himmler hoped that this gesture of humanity would win him the goodwill of the Western Allies and allow him to negotiate a separate peace agreement. It was an obscene calculation. The same man who had ordered the murder of millions now tried to use the release of a few thousand as a diplomatic bargaining chip. The victims, once again, were treated as pawns in a power game. First, he killed them to consolidate his power within the Reich. Now he freed them to try to retain some power after the defeat. Himmler also harbored the fantasy that the Western Allies would need him as an ally against the Soviet Union. He believed, in his delusion, that his experience in security management and his knowledge of Soviet communism would make him a valuable partner for the West in the post-war era. It is difficult to determine if this belief was genuine or if Himmler simply clung to any straw in his desperation. When Hitler discovered Himmler's betrayal, thanks to a Reuters agency broadcast that reported on the contacts between Himmler and Bernadotte, the Führer's reaction was apocalyptic. In his bunker, surrounded by ruins, Hitler shouted that Himmler was the worst traitor in history and ordered his arrest. But he no longer had the power to execute that order. The Reich was crumbling around him. 2 days later, Hitler committed suicide, and Himmler fled. The Reichsführer SS, the man who had sent millions to their deaths, put on an eye patch, shaved his moustache, and blended in with the demobilized German soldiers, wandering through northern Germany in the final days of May 1945. He did not try to organize resistance. He did not try to fight. He did not try to die with his boots on, as the rhetoric he himself had imposed on his SS preached. He simply fled. And when he was captured, when the British identified him, he bit his cyanide capsule and killed himself. He did not face trial. He did not give an account. He did not look his victims or his judges in the eye. He died like a coward, evading responsibility for the crimes that he himself had designed, ordered, and supervised with meticulous efficiency for 12 years. As Reichsführer of the SS, Himmler received orders directly from Hitler to carry out ideological policies that the laws of the state would not permit. This authority of the Führer, based on ideology, allowed for the authorization of indefinite imprisonment and mass murder. And when that authority crumbled, Himmler had nothing. Not courage, not dignity, not the capacity to face the consequences of what he had done. Heydrich, for his part, died in 1942, 3 years before the end of the war. He was never judged. He was never captured. He never had to sit before a court and listen to the list of his crimes. He died in a Prague hospital, attended by the best doctors of the Reich, with Himmler crying at his bedside and Hitler commemorating his service to the cause. He died as a hero of Nazism, not as the war criminal he was. And the Wannsee Conference, the meeting where the extermination of 11 million people was planned in 90 minutes, was never brought to trial. Of the 15 high-ranking officials who participated in it, only 2 were judged after the war for their role in the Holocaust. 2 out of 15. The others died before, fled, or were acquitted. Justice, when it came, was incomplete. The Nuremberg trials condemned the big fish, who had not managed to escape or commit suicide. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher. But thousands of mid-level and low-level perpetrators escaped any punishment. They returned to their normal lives, became businessmen, teachers, doctors, civil servants. Some lived comfortably into the 80s and 90s. Some died of old age in their beds, surrounded by their families, without ever having paid for what they did. Is that justice? No. But it is history. And history, unlike movies, does not always have a satisfactory ending. What we can do is remember, preserve the memory, tell the stories, ensure that future generations know what happened, how it happened, and who was responsible. Because, as stated in the memorial that now occupies the Wannsee Villa, the objective is to keep the memory alive and learn from history so as not to repeat it. Himmler said in Posen that the annihilation of the Jews was a glorious page in our history that was never written and never will be written. He was wrong. It was written. It is being written right now, and it will continue to be written as long as there are people who refuse to forget. Between 1941 and 1945, the Jewish population of Europe was systematically persecuted and murdered during the largest genocide of the 20th century. 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the European Jewish population, more than 1 million children, entire communities that had existed for centuries were wiped off the map in a matter of months. And behind it all, from the first SD file to the last gas chamber of Auschwitz, were Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the Reichsführer and the blonde beast, the architect and the engineer, the mystic and the pragmatist. 2 men who, together, transformed hate into a system, ambition into extermination, and strategy into genocide. Hate, power, or strategy. All at once. And that is what made them so dangerous. It was not a single motivation that drove the machinery of death. It was the convergence of all of them, amplified by a system that rewarded cruelty, punished compassion, and converted human beings into numbers, into cargo, into problems to be solved. The anti-Semitism of Himmler and Heydrich was not simply hatred, it was institutionalized ideology. And that institutionalization, that process by which a sentiment becomes law, law becomes policy, policy becomes bureaucracy, and bureaucracy becomes industrial death, is the most important lesson this story can offer us. Because hate, by itself, does not kill 6 million people. Power, by itself, does not either. Strategy, by itself, does not build gas chambers. But when the three are combined in a system without checks, without opposition, without moral breaks, the result is Auschwitz. The result is Treblinka. The result is Babi Yar. The result is a world where 15 men can sit down for coffee and decide, in an hour and a half, the death of 11 million people. And that world is not as far from our own as we would like to believe. Now I want to ask you something. Did you know all these details? Did you know that the Wannsee conference lasted only 90 minutes? Did you know that Heydrich lived his whole life under the suspicion of having Jewish blood? Did you know that Himmler tried to negotiate with the Allies while his extermination camps were still running? Did you know that most of those responsible were never judged? If something you have heard today has surprised you, disturbed you, or made you think, leave it in the comments. We want to know which part of this story impacted you the most, and if you think something is missing, if there is any aspect of Himmler and Heydrich's plan that you want us to investigate further, the medical experiments, the escape routes of the Nazis after the war, the fate of the SD archives, the history of the Sonderkommandos, tell us. Your curiosity is what drives this channel, and if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Because stories like this need to be told, they need to reach more people, they need to be kept alive in the collective memory. Subscribe, click, like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Every subscription, every like, every time you share, you are helping history not to be forgotten. Because the day we forget what Himmler and Heydrich did, that day we will be one step closer to allowing someone to do it again. This was all. Until the next video.